This is a reading from the lessons on the Epistle of St. Paul to the Romans. The test. When man awoke from his first sleep and found his companion by his side, he felt that his happiness had been rendered complete by God. It was already very great beforehand. Everything in Adam and around Adam had been made so that he could enjoy complete happiness, healthy and holy, and the delight that is Eden was not only around, but also within Adam. The garden full of plant, animal, and marine beauty surrounded him. However, within him, a garden of spiritual beauty blossomed with every kind of virtue, ready to mature into fruits of holy perfection. And there was the tree of knowledge, suited to his taste, and that of the supernatural life. Grace. Neither were the precious waters of the divine spring missing, which divided itself into 4 branches, and always sprinkled the virtues of man with a new wave, so that they could grow gigantically and turn him ever more so into a faithful mirror of God. As a natural creature, he enjoyed what he saw, the beauty of a virgin world that just a short while ago had come from the will of God. He enjoyed what he could, his dominion over the lower creatures. Everything had been placed by God at the service of man, from the sun to the insect, so that everything would be a delight to him. As a supernatural creature, he enjoyed a reasoning and most gentle ecstasy, the understanding of the essence of God, love, of the relationships of love between the immense one who gave himself and the creature who loved by adoring him. Genesis veils this faculty of man and this communicating to him by God in the phrase, having heard the voice of God walking in Eden in the cool of the evening. As much as the Father had given knowledge to his adoptive children, proportioned to their state, he still continued to teach them, because infinite is the love of God. And after having yearned to give again, and so much more does he give, the more the creature is a daughter to him. God always gives himself to the one who gives himself generously to him. Therefore, when man awoke and saw the woman made in his likeness, he felt that his happiness as a creature was complete by having all the humanity and all the superhumanity, being that the love gave himself to the love of man. The only limitation placed by God on the immense possessions of man was the prohibition to eat of the fruits from the tree of knowledge of good and evil. This would have been a useless harvest, and unjustified, for man already had that knowledge which was necessary for him, and a measure superior to that established by God could only cause harm. Consider, God does not prohibit to eat of the fruits from the tree of life, because man had a natural need for these in order to live a healthy and long existence, until a more living divine desire of revealing himself totally to the adoptive Son would not make God pronounce the following: Son, ascend to my dwelling place and submerge yourself into your God. The call, without the suffering of death, to the celestial paradise. The tree of life that is encountered at the beginning of the book of the Great Revelation, Genesis chapter 2, verse 9, and chapter 3, verse 22, and that is found again at the end of the book of the Great Revelation, the Bible, Apocalypse of John, chapter 22, verse 2 and verse 14, is the figure of the incarnate Word, whose fruit, the redemption, hung from the wood of the cross, of that Jesus Christ who is the bread of life, the fount of living water, grace, and who has given you life with his death, and you can always eat and drink of him in order to live the life of the just and have eternal life. God does not prohibit Adam from eating of the fruits from the tree of life. However, he forbids from eating those useless ones from the tree of knowledge, because an excess of knowledge would have awoken pride in man, who would then have believed himself to be equal to God on account of his newly acquired knowledge, and he would have foolishly believed himself capable of being able to possess it without danger, with the consequent rising of an abusive right of self-judgment of his own actions and of acting, consequently by trampling on every duty of filial obedience towards his Creator, given that, at this point he was similar to him in knowledge, his Creator, who had lovingly showed him right and wrong, directly or by infused grace and knowledge. The measure of God is always just. He who wants more of what God has given to him is concupiscent, imprudent, and irreverent. He offends love. He who takes abusively is a thief and a violent man. He offends love. He who wants to act independently in every respect to the supernatural law is a rebel. He offends love. In the presence of the divine command, the progenitors had to obey without asking the whys that are always the undoing of love, faith, and hope. When God orders or acts, one must obey and do His will, without asking why He orders or acts in that way. Every action of His is good, even if it does not seem to the being who is limited in his knowledge. Why should they not have gone to that tree, gathered those fruits, and have eaten of those fruits? There is no use in knowing. Obeying is useful, nothing else, and being happy with having received much. Obedience is love and respect, and it is the measure of love and respect. The more one loves and venerates a person, the more one obeys him or her. Here now, being the one ordered by God, the infinitely great, the good, the generous benefactor of man, man, out of respect and gratitude, should have given to God not a lot of love, but all the adoring love which he was capable of giving, and therefore all the obedience, without analyzing the reasons of the divine prohibition. The discussions presuppose self-judgment and criticism to the order or other people's actions. Judging is a difficult thing, and seldom is the judgment just. But never is it just when one judges a divine order useless, wrong, or unjust. Man had to obey. The test of this ability of his, which is the measure of love and respect, was in the way in which he would have or would not have known how to obey. The means, the tree and the apple, two small, insignificant things if you compare them to the abundance that God had granted to man. And what? He had given himself, God, and he prohibited the admiring of a fruit? And what? He had given a natural and supernatural life to the dust. He had infused his breath into man, and he prohibited the picking of a fruit? And what? He had made man the king of all the creatures and considered him not as his servant but a son, and he prohibited from eating a fruit? To one who does not know how to wisely meditate, this episode can seem to be like an unexplainable punctiliousness, similar to a whim of a benefactor who, having covered a beggar with riches, then prohibits him from picking up a little rock deposited in the dust. However, it isn't like this. The apple was not only fruit in reality, it was also the symbol of the divine right and of human duty. Even when God calls and extraordinarily benefits, the beneficiaries must always remember that he is God, and that man must never prevaricate, even if he feels extraordinarily loved. And yet, this is the test that only a few elect know how to surmount. They want more of what they have already received, and they go to gather what was not given, and that is how they find the snake and his poisonous fruits. Beware, O elect ones of God. Always remember that in your garden, so full of the gifts of God, there is always the tree of trial, and always looking to entwine itself around it is the adversary of God and yours, in order to snatch an instrument from God and seduce you to pride and cupidity, to rebellion. Do not violate the right of God. Do not trample on the law of your duty. Never. Many seem to be the instruments of God, the voices, too many according to some. I say to you all, to the theologians and to the faithful, that 100 times 100 more would they be if all those whom God calls to a special ministry knew how not to gather that which God has not given, so as to have more still. All the faithful have in the Decalogue the tree of knowledge of good and evil, their test of faith, love, and obedience. For the voices and the extraordinary instruments, more than ever is that tree alluring and a snare of Satan, because the greater the donation, the easier it is for pride and concupiscence to rise, the presumption of being sure of saving oneself in any case. Instead, I tell you that the more one has received, the more it is one's duty to be perfect, so as not to have a greater condemnation, which will not be given to the one who, having received only a little, has the extenuating circumstance of having known only a little. I anticipate a question. Did that tree then bear good fruits and bad fruits? It bore fruits no different from those of any other plant. However, it was the plant of good and evil. It became so according to the behavior of man, not so much as towards the plant, as towards the divine order. To obey is good, to disobey is bad. God knew that Satan would have gone to that tree to tempt. God knows everything. The wicked fruit was the word of Satan tasted by Eve. The danger of not drawing near to the plant was in the disobedience. To the pure knowledge which God had given, Satan inoculated his impure malice that soon fermented even in the flesh. However, Satan first corrupted the spirit, making it a rebel, and then made the intellect astute. Oh, well did they know afterwards the knowledge of good and evil, because everything, even the new sight for them, for which they then knew to be naked, averted to them, because everything, even the new sight for which they then knew to be naked, averted them to the loss of grace that had made them blessed in their intelligent innocence up to that hour, and therefore of the loss of supernatural life. Naked, not so much for the garments as for the gifts of God, poor for having wanted to be like God, dead for having feared of dying with their species if they hadn't acted directly. They committed the first act against love with pride, disobedience, diffidence, doubt, rebellion, spiritual concupiscence, and lastly, with carnal concupiscence. I say lastly. Some believe that carnal concupiscence was instead the first act. No, God is order in all things. Even the offenses towards the divine law, man sinned first against God by wanting to be similar to God. God, in the knowledge of good and evil, and in the absolute and thus illicit freedom to act as he pleased, and wished against all advice and prohibition of God, then against love, by loving himself disordinately, by denying God the reverential love that he is due, by placing the I in God's place, and by hating his future neighbor, his own offspring, to whom he brought about the inheritance of sin and condemnation, and lastly, against his dignity as the regal creature who had the gift of perfect dominion over the senses. The sensual sin could not have occurred for as long as the state of grace endured, and the other consequent states. There could have been temptation, but not the consummation of the sensual sin for as long as innocence lasted, and therefore the dominion of reason over the senses. Punishment. Not inordinate, but just. In order to understand it, one needs to consider the perfection of Adam and Eve. By considering that height, one can measure the greatness of the fall into that abyss. If some of you were to be taken by God and placed in a new Eden, leaving you who you are, though giving you the same commands he had given to Adam, and you were to disobey like Adam, do you believe that God would condemn you with the same severity with which he condemned Adam? No. God is just. He knows what tremendous inheritance is within you. The consequences of original sin have been repaired by Christ, insofar as he is grace, but the weakness of the lesion in the original perfection remains, and this weakness is constituted by foments, similar to infective germs which have remained latent in man, but that are always ready to enter in strength and overpower the creature. They are even in the holier of saints, and sanctity, after all, is none other than the fruit of the struggle and the continual victory which the soul and the reasoning of the just one sustain and suffer through the assaults of the foments in order to remain faithful to the love. Now God, who is infinitely just, would not be inexorable with one of you as he was with Adam, because he would consider your weaknesses. With Adam he was, being that Adam was endowed with all that could have made him the victor, and easily a victor, against temptation. Hence the punishment, that punishment in which one sees that if the precarious man did not respect the limits placed by God, God respected limits that he had placed towards man. God did not violate the free will of man, whereas man violated the rights of God. Neither before nor after the sin did God violate man's freedom to act. He subjected him to a test. Being God, he did not ignore that man would not have overcome it. However, it was just that he subjected him to it in order to confirm him in grace, like he had, for the same end, submitted the angels to the test, and confirmed in grace those who amongst them who had won the test, and submitting him to the test, he left him free to act with respect to it. If God had wanted to violate the free will of man in choosing his own destiny, he would have either not proposed the test, or he would have bound the powers of the will in a way that man would have been impeded from acting badly. So, too, if he had wanted to reward him in spite of everything, he would have either forgiven him everything in advance, or in order to have grounds to forgive him, he would have aroused the perfect contrition in his heart, or at least an attrition for the goods which he had lost, by helping, with a ray of his love, to turn the imperfect sorrow of attrition for the loss of the goods present in that instant and future instance into the perfect sorrow of contrition for the offense made towards God and for the loss of his grace and love. However, all these cases would have been injustices towards the angels who had been submitted to the test, who did not have their powers of the will bound, who had not been forgiven in advance, and who did not have aroused in their beings and by God himself any impulse of contrition or attrition capable of arousing divine forgiveness. It is true that the angels were favored more than men in not sinning, because of the gifts of grace and those of their nature, spirits without a body and therefore without senses, and for being thus free from internal pressures of sense and from external pressures, the serpent, and above all, through the knowledge of God, and in spite of this, they sinned without extenuating circumstances due to ignorance and the stimulus of the senses, but through pure malice and sacrilegious will. However, there was none of what was said before, neither from God nor from man. God respected human will. Man persevered in his state of revolt towards his divine benefactor. He proudly left Eden after having lied, because by now his joining with falsehood had occurred, and after having cited poor excuses for his sin, while having made himself a belt of leaves, he testified that not because they were naked and were ashamed of appearing so to him who had created and kept them clothed only with grace and innocence were they fearful of appearing so before God, but because they were guilty. Fear, yes. Repentance, no. Hence God, after having expelled them from Eden, placed 2 cherubims on the threshold of the same, so that the 2 prevaricators would not fraudulently re-enter in order to loot the fruits of the tree of life, rendering nil a part of the just punishment, and defrauding God once again of his right, that of giving and taking life, after having kept it healthy, happy, and long-lived with the salutary fruits of the tree of life. Therefore, a just punishment. The privation of how much man had spontaneously scorned grace, integrity, immortality, immunity, and knowledge, and hence the loss of the paternal love of God, of his mighty help, and hence the weakness of the wounded soul, the fever of the awakened flesh, reason, delirious and overwhelming, and hence the fear of God and the loss of Eden, where life was without hardship and sorrow, and hence hardship, death, the subjection of woman to man, the animosity between man and man, amongst the children of a womb, crime, abuse, all the evils that torment humanity, fear of death and judgment, the torment of having provoked sorrow and of transmitting it to those most loved in one with life. Consequences. Beyond the immediate and personal condemnation and its immediate and personal consequences, the sin of Adam and the condemnation provoked by it has had consequences that will last until the end of time, weighing heavily upon humanity. As the forefather of the human family, Adam has transmitted his infirmity to his descendants. No different is it when a defective man procreates children. With more or less virulence, the poison of the disease are in his offspring, and in the offspring of the offspring, and even if with the appropriate medications, the hereditary disease, from being virulent and the giver of death, is able to transform itself into a more benign form, never will those children, though, and the children of the children, be as healthy as those who have come from a healthy blood. It is written, by the work of one man, sin entered into the world. And it is the truth. The book of wisdom, the letters to the Hebrews, and the book of Psalms tell of this sorrow before Paul. It is always from God, therefore, because it is always God who speaks through the mouth of his inspired ones. This sorrow fills the world. It passes on from generation to generation, nor will it end for as long as the world does not end. With its howl, it has filled the place where Adam, with effort, drew bread from the clods onto which his perspiration dripped, and it has spread throughout the earth, and the horizons, gorges, forests, and animals, shuddering, have felt it and have transmitted it to one another. And like a blinding light, it made Adam and Eve see the immensity of their sin, not only committed against God, but also towards their flesh and blood. Until that moment, the verdict of God had not yet destroyed the rebellion of man, who with the natural adaptability of an animal, because man lacking in grace is nothing more than the most perfect of all the animals, had quickly adapted himself to his new destiny, no longer easy and blissful as it was before, but not lacking in human joys, which compensated for human sorrows. The passion of the sense satisfied itself in the companion's flesh, not holily joined as God had wanted, and as the innocent man, full of knowledge, had understood in Eden, to make himself one flesh only, the joy of creating by themselves. O persistent pride! New creatures, fooling themselves in this way of being similar to God, the Creator, the dominion upon animals, the satisfaction of the harvests, and of being self-sufficient without having to thank anyone. Sensual joys, but nevertheless joys. Oh, how much obscurity of the smoke of pride and of the mists of unrestrained concupiscences obstinately persisted in the arrogant two. Childbirth was obtained with pain, but the joy of children compensated that pain. Food was obtained with effort, but the stomach filled itself just the same, and gluttony was satisfied, as the earth was full of good things. Disease and death were distant, and perfectly created bodies enjoyed health and virility that made the arrogant too think that life was long-lived, even if not eternal. And fermenting pride provoked the deriding thought, "Where is therefore the punishment of God? We are happy even without him." One day, however, the green of the fields on which the multicolored flowers created by God blossomed turned red with the first human blood shed upon the earth. And the mother howled upon the dead body of sweet Abel, and the father understood that it had not been a vain threat that promised, "You shall return to the ground from where you had been taken, for you are dust, and into dust you shall return." And Adam died twice, for himself and for his son, since a father dies the death of his children, seeing them dead. And Eve gave birth with torture, giving to the earth the lifeless body of her beloved, and she understood what it was to give birth in sin. However, equally in the same hour in which, and it was mercy again, the punishment of God struck, pride died and had given birth to repentance, the new life, for which the guilty two began the ascent on the path of justice, and they merited, after a lengthy expiation and wait, divine forgiveness through the merits of Christ. And of Mary, oh, allow me here to celebrate this truth of the Immaculate, who is mine, and who for our combined love has given to the world the Word made flesh, the Emmanuel. Out of an act of unfaithfulness of the woman, mankind became acquainted with sin, pain, and death. Out of the faithfulness of the woman, mankind has obtained the regeneration of grace, and consequently forgiveness, pure joy and life. Out of concupiscence, death, all deaths. Out of the purity of a triple virginity, of body, intellect, and spirit, life, the true life, and of the risen flesh of the just ones living forever, and of the mind open to the truth, and of the spirit reborn to grace. Out of the union with Satan, brotherly hate and deicide. Out of the union with God, brotherly love and spiritual love, which embrace divinity and humanity, and they effuse on both, and they work for both, the incarnate love and the virginal love, both offered voluntarily, totally, and consumed, so that God could be consoled and man saved. The death of Abel shattered the pride of Adam, and made Eve an expert of the most atrocious birth to darkness. The death of Christ shattered the sin, and it demonstrated to humanity what it costs to give birth to grace. The howl of Eve has a correspondence to the cry of Mary at the death of her most holy Son. I say to those who believe Mary to be above sorrow because she is full of grace, I say that not even Eve suffered in her deserved desolation that which Mary innocently suffered. Because if the howl of Eve marked the birth of repentance, the cry of Mary marked the birth of a new era. And if in that hour, marked by the first human blood scattered by criminal violence, for which the earth was cursed twice, and the ascent had its beginning towards justice, in the 9th hour, marked by the last drop of divine blood, redemption descended from the heavens, flowing like a river of salvation from the two innocent and wounded hearts of the Son and Mother. Truly, you have life not only through the merits of Jesus, but also through those of Mary, and she, the Mother of life, the Virgin Mother, pure, innocent, who did not experience labor pains in giving birth to her Jesus, according to the law of the fallen flesh, but experienced, however, and very well indeed, labor pains of the most sorrowful birth, by giving birth to you, sinful humanity, to the new life of grace. Through only one man, man knows death. Through the one man, man knows life. Through Adam, humanity has inherited the sin and its consequences. Through Jesus, the Son of God, and Mary, humanity again inherits grace and its consequences. This grace, though not canceling all the earthly consequences of original sin, since sorrow, death, and stimuli remain to give you sorrow, fear, and struggle, it, grace, strongly helps you to endure present sorrow with the hope of heaven. It helps you to face the fear of dying with the knowledge of divine mercy, and it helps you to react and control stimuli or foments with supernatural aids through the merits of Christ and the sacraments instituted by him. I said, grace, though not canceling all the consequences of the sin. This is a point that many rebel against by saying, is this just? Couldn't the Redeemer have given back all the perfection? It is just. Everything in God is just. Man was not wounded in a conflict with God for which God should feel obliged to repair the damage made either voluntarily or involuntarily. Man voluntarily wounded himself and consciously wounded himself. Now, when a man injures himself in such a serious way in everyday life that he remains either mutilated or defective or marked at least with serious scars, not even the work of a doctor can cancel all the damage, and above all, reconstruct the lost parts. Adam mutilated himself of grace and supernatural life, of innocence, integrity, immunity, immortality, and knowledge. And as forefather of the entire human family, he has passed on his sorrowful inheritance to all his descendants. However, humanity, more fortunate than the single man, has been cured through Jesus, Savior, Redeemer. More still, the recreation in grace, the life of the soul, and through the sacraments instituted by him, the virtues that they instill, and to my gifts, he has also obtained the means to rise always more in perfection, as far as reaching the summit with the supercreation, which is sanctity. However, not even the sacrifice of the man-God, capable and sufficient of restoring to you the lost gifts and of re-elevating you all to the supernatural order, that is, to the capacity to love, know, and to serve God in this life in order to possess him joyfully forevermore in the other. In the other, has cancelled the scars of the great wounds that man has voluntarily inflicted upon himself, and especially those of the triple concupiscence, which is always ready to re-wound itself again if the spirit is not watchful in restraining evil passions. I have also said, the knowledge of divine mercy. Yes, just as the inheritance of the sin has obtained the Redeemer for you, so it has also obtained for you the knowledge of infinite charity, wisdom, and divine powers. Man, the regenerated child of God through Jesus, knows what Adam did not know. He knows the immensity of the love of the Father who gives his only begotten Son to cancel with his blood the decree of the condemnation of humanity fallen in its forefather. Adam, through infused knowledge, and moreover through grace, which elevating him to the supernatural order had rendered him capable of knowing God, knew just how much God loved him, because everything around and within Adam had the voice of divine love. And Adam, through the election to the supernatural order, knew how to love much. He knew how to love within the limit that God had judged sufficient during life to prepare man for the vision and the enjoyment of God after passing from earth to heaven. But never, not even in the greater raptures of love, was the innocent Adam able to ascend with his desire to know and love as far as to the center of the truth. Never was he able to submerge himself into this ardent furnace of love that is also the truth, and never was he able to possess the total knowledge of that truth that has the name of infinite love. A man living on earth cannot see what God is, and neither the man Adam, as soon as he was created and abounding in gifts. Everything had the voice of God. Everything spoke of God. Everything drew him towards God. Man was the greatly loved one, and showered with gifts in order to help him to love. However, between man and God, there is always an abyss. There are two abysses that look at each other, and the greater one attracts the smaller one. He flashes in front of his spirit. He dresses him with his fires, and he makes him rich with his blazing lights upon the spirit of man, as in a continual infusion of wisdom. The divine love has, for man, the inviting gesture of two arms and a bosom which open and offer themselves through the embrace which beatifies. And human love gives wings to man, so that he can forget the earth and hurl himself towards heaven, towards God who is calling him. However, a law of justice establishes that the total encounter, the fusion, is to be had only after the test, which is perfected in grace. For this reason, the more man rises